Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. That's true that I think really the only one, not only in Germany, but worldwide, being a computer scientist as a data protection commissioner. Meanwhile, there are a few deputies, so they have already some more influence. And the GDPR is quite new, only 1.5 months old, so there are many open questions, I think even more now for me than before the application, because otherwise I was able to read and to understand with my background. And now everything is challenging that because everybody is reading the GDPR from their background as well. First of all, who has heard nothing of the GDPR yet? Okay. Who has read a little bit within? Yes, okay. Who has read everything? I don't believe it. No, it's I think I read parts 100 times. I'm still learning. So this cannot be the final answer, but of course the beginning of further debate, and you will play an important role in making true what is good in the GDPR and perhaps finding solutions also for the rest. It was very nice to hear Schleswig-Holstein pronounced here already. We are in the top north of Germany. You see Berlin, there we are here. It's a few hundred kilometers away. And so we have been existent for 30 years now, I think, but I'm there for 23 years. And we are responsible for data protection and for freedom of information. And also, we do the data protection stuff for the public service and the private service, which means in Germany there are 18 colleagues doing similar stuff and people for the churches and for the broadcasting companies. Germany is a very complicated area. But now, first of all, what is data protection? Everybody knows already what data protection is, of course, but sometimes it's good to reflect what you think you know. Then I talk about the general data protection regulation, then about the more exciting stuff, what to do now with what we have, and have a few conclusions or debates. So data protection is mainly about data. Probably most people would agree, although if this is on a slide, probably that's not true. It's not mainly about data, but it's about humans. It's humans and their rights, their personality rights. So it's not the backup strategy, right? The backup strategy is necessary, but this is not what data protection law is mainly about. And if we are thinking about system design, we want to approach the very big questions as well. So are there effects on individuals, and what about effects on society? In former times, everybody knew, okay, there's a central database, and if there's a hacking attack, this may infringe some rights of people. But now we have a blurring situation with perhaps presidential elections that may be influenced by social networks because of data protection analysis of people. So something which is not really clear, that this is now part of our task as well, and of your task if you are developing such systems. Of course, everybody needs to be a crypto expert, otherwise we cannot survive in the data protection field. No, not true. This is Diffie-Hellman, but I'm not telling about Diffie-Hellman crypto functionality, but about the perspective. These are Alice and Bob, and the crypto people are always so funny, and always poor Alice and poor Bob have to communicate. And the information security perspective means that there's an adversary, an attacker, and that's Eve for eavesdropping, or Mallory perhaps, if there is also some influence on the code perhaps. So this is now where it's totally clear the communication has to be protected, and there are very clever crypto algorithms that help. But from the data protection perspective, this is not sufficient. We think Bob may be the adversary as well. So Alice is telling her life, her secrets to Bob, and everything is protected on the communication way, and Bob is misusing this information. This would be a data protection problem. If Bob is in organization, at least, because if it's only a fight between individuals, There, we don't want to have those cases. There are some, but usually this is more a civil court thing that has to be also debated. So the adversary may be Bob. And this means that data processing as such is already a potential interference with fundamental rights. This is not so bad, because also if you go to the doctor and you may have some impact on your physical, on your bodily privacy, because it's necessary to heal your disease or so. So this is not something which is untypical, but we have to think also about the organizations that may be the adversaries in the data protection field, and that Alice may have to get help. And this is the normal situation, that there are very powerful data processing organizations. So the GDPR is addressing the very big ones as well as the very small ones, but especially the big ones. And we see that usually data protection law is settled because of imbalance in power, because there are the very small Alices on the left-hand side, or also small institutions. We are, by the way, also very small as the Data Protection Commissioner. But how to get the information? What is being done there? So it's more a cloudy, perhaps also blurred perspective, that nobody is really clear on what is happening there. And here, the perspective of the individual should be supported, should be strengthened. And there we come with the general data protection regulation. People often attack me saying, "What did you do there? It's very bad." And I say, "Oh, sorry, we are the persons who have to take this GDPR, and we have to make sure that it's enforced." And we also in the beginning wrote so many letters in what we would like to see in the GDPR, and some parts are there and some are not, and some are different. And so it's not my GDPR. Still, I'm not bashing the GDPR. I have to work with that, and I try to derive the best things for individuals, for their data protection and privacy from the GDPR, and from everything else what is now coming. So the main idea was one for all and all for one. This is, of course, a very old idea, and at least also in the Data Protection Directive in Europe from 1995. So if we discuss very old SQL or Internet, 1995 for a law on data protection which is related to information processing is very, very old. And they had the idea of harmonization. All within Europe, everybody should have the same data protection level. Good idea. Good for companies. Good for everything which is happening cross-border. Very good. The same level, harmonization, modernization. So this was the story of 1995, and it's the same story now. Because 1995 did not work so well. There was the directive, but every country, and especially Germany, did not transpose it in a correct way. Everybody did something different, which is okay with this directive thing, the legal instrument. Now it's a change, it's a regulation. And the regulation is effective immediately and directly unless there are opening clauses. And there are 70 opening clauses, quite a lot. About 10 are mandatory, the rest is optional. And so the member states still have a say. Surely it's not possible to have a harmonization within Europe or other states in such difficult topics. So it's really an abstract compromise, and now it has to be filled with life. So the GDPR is finished, it's ready, it's there. Still, if you read it, you find that you cannot understand everything, or perhaps only very few things, because it's very abstract. And in this case, it's also abstract on purpose. It's not a bug, it's a feature, because people tell me it should last for 20, 30, 40 years. I told you about 1995, it's so long ago. But how is it possible to have a legal norm that exists for decades in the information processing setting, only if it is very abstract and if refinement is done over the time? And we can all help by progressing the state of the art, for example. There are very many instruments. Most of them are old, so people are very astonished now, but usually the directive had most of the instruments already. But what is new is the market location principle. And here it's not only relevant for the Europeans in the room, but for everybody, because even if a company is not within Europe, but addressing European citizens or people being in Europe, perhaps by selling goods or only by monitoring, tracking people, users, then they have to adhere to the European law, which is not very astounding, but in this case, it's a new thing. We already have the first cases of companies not being in the European Union, and now how to handle those cases if there's not really the person. There has to be a person to address, okay, but what about enforcement? Responsibility, this is, I think it's an old thing. People think it's a new thing. The controller is responsible. So data protection by design, by default, I will tell about. Security is now also more a legal base or requirement than before, which is okay, but in my perspective, it had not worked well in the past. Data protection impact assessment is about thinking about the consequences and documenting that, and always because of the risks. And the risks are not the same as we have learned from the IT and information security sector. It's not about only confidentiality, integrity, availability. It's about the risks for the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So to give an example, for example, the risk of discrimination, of being treated unfairly, of having a reputation damage, something like that, which is often very hard to conquer in the real world. Certification can play a role in the future, and one thing because one thing is the reason because the media took up the GDPR very, very rightly, I think. What were the fines? The very high fines, 20 million euros or 4% of the company's income, and this is for big companies a good incentive, not having this big sanction. So the sanction can be an incentive, and for the rest, but it's still quite. It makes some. Impression, and people often are very afraid or are panicking. And I think this should not be done. Always, it has to be taken into account. What is the situation? What do we have here? And is it possible to do already now the very best? Very often it's not, but let's go into that direction. And we will probably have much necessity for negotiating among the data protection authorities, and then everything again will be challenged. I had a case before the European Court of Justice. We have now the 7th or 8th year before we go there. It takes so long. Data processing has changed so much in the time. So this is a solution which may be the last word, the last answer if we have the European court decisions, but if it takes too long, it does not play a role. Okay, all in all, I think it's a powerful toolbox, but it can be used also in a wrong way, and now it depends how to interpret it, how to make the cases, and the cases are there. The data protection principles are laid down in Article 5. Again, they are not very new. Still, this is what you have to argue that you have thought about it. The first one is like having a legal baseline, having fair data processing, being transparent about what is happening. Then the question of purpose. There's always a purpose of the application of the service. By the way, a library, what is the purpose of a library? Very often, if it's a computer code, it can be used for so many different purposes. So it's very difficult for a developer to think already ahead what could be done. Are there very risky data treatments, processing procedures happening? So this is more difficult, and therefore the developers are hardly addressed in the GDPR. But if the purpose is defined, then the data has to be limited for what is necessary for the purpose. So you may not ask for the shoe size if you need the financial data, for example, or the other way around. Data minimization is related to minimize the data to what is necessary. The correctness of the data is, of course, important for everybody, I think. Storage limitation is also about early deletion. If you don't need the data anymore, erase them. But often you have to keep them for other purposes. And the last one is on data security. The accountability is regulated as well as you have to be able to prove that you're compliant with the GDPR. And if I say you, it's not the developers, it's those who are processing the data. What is personal data? This is always the key questions, because if it's not personal, then the GDPR does not apply. But very many data are personal data, and here they are broadly defined. I think, again, copy-paste from the older law, but perhaps sometimes in a different understanding. Any information that is related to a subject, a data subject, that is identified or identifiable. And then we see a little bit more on identifiability. It could be by a reference to an identifier. And there you see, for example, location data. If I know location data and the time, then it's a direct spot. If it's really the granular information, then very often the identifiability is there. Or online identifiers, the IP address, for example, MAC addresses, they are personal data. It does not mean that you may not work with them, but the GDPR at first applies. And then you have to check whether the risk is treated, the risks are mitigated as far as necessary. There are 6 options for having a legal ground, a legal foundation, and you always have to find one. So it's different in America. Unless you have specific laws, you can start your computing usually, and then later on perhaps you have to check. But here it's about you have first to think what is your legal basis, your foundation. 3 of them are mostly done in the public service, something which is not so much related here, perhaps the vital interest or so, but usually it's by consent. If the data subject wants this service or wants to disclose the information, wants to share the data, this has to be defined. Via a contract, if there's some usage scenario, or the last one, the legitimate interest. And I think those 3 are mostly now under scrutiny because they can be used whenever, for each situation, and then of course the argumentation will start, the negotiation. Is this now really a legitimate interest? And if it is, are there overriding interests of the data subjects? So this is something we saw at the first day of GDPR, that data transfer was made possible that was forbidden before because of legitimate interest. And I think this is there's room for interpretation at least. But does not mean that it's not possible to do data processing. The rights of the data subjects are strengthened. I will show you a few pictures because it's already too much text. Consent is something where it's a right of the person to give consent, but also beware. Consent is not so good as a basic foundation for your data processing. It can be withdrawn with effect for the future, not for the past, obviously. But still, if you need the data, then probably you need a kind of contract, some user agreement, and not something where you think the user should decide on its own and can withdraw this consent. So the contract may be very often the better solution. But then it has to be clear what is part of the contract. For example, I pay for this good, I receive this product, but the newsletter subscription, this can be on the basis of consent. And in the contract, write down what you want to do with the data. Do you need them? We are here at a data conference. For other purposes, do you need to derive, to optimize your services? Is this part of the contract, or should it be based on consent? The terms and conditions obviously also play a role, and there's also European law in this section where it's clear it must not be something which cannot be expected. So if people have the feeling it's not what they thought it would be with the data processing. It can be a Twitter shitstorm, of course, but it can also be illegal. Right to information. If you collect data, then you have to inform the people. If you collect it from other sources, you also have to inform them, unless they know that already. So if you buy databases and use the data on persons, then and they cannot know that you have the data, it's their right to get the information directly. So you have to push the information. Usually within 1 month. There can be exceptions, then it's 3 months, but usually 1 month. The other way, it can be the request of the data subject. I want to know what you have about me. This is the right to access. It's nothing new. But many people did not know about it, and now many people are writing letters or emails. They want to know, or they know already that the data should be deleted, and now they want to check whether they are really deleted or whether they get this information with the right to access. And again, within 1 month's time, usually, if this is possible, meaning for the development, where to know, how do you know where the data is, or who can have perhaps copies of the data sets if it's not a centralized approach. It's not so easy, so it depends already on the design of the code. Right to rectification, I think this is usually in the interest of everybody. Everybody wants correct addresses. It must not be the case that I want you to correct the data into something wrong. So this is not rectification, but if the data set is wrong, then it's necessary to correct it. So this is here, again, within 1 month's time. Right to erasure, the deletion sounds very effective because then the data has to be gone. If it's a contract, we had a financial transaction, are you allowed to delete the information of the last receipt, the bills, the invoices? So tax law usually prevents that. So in Germany, you can ask for that, of course, but still, usually the invoices have to be kept for sometimes 10 years, sometimes even longer. And so they cannot be deleted. But of course, you must not, as a controller, use this information then if the person does not want that. So they have to be archived in a way where they are not part of the regular processing. Within 1 month, of course. Data portability. This is a new thing, and it's not very much related to data processing. It's more the idea of being able to switch the providers, to take all your data from one social network or one cloud to put it into another cloud or social network. It should be handed to you or to the other provider in a digital format, a machine-readable format. Some people argue, and I think it can be all right, it's a PDF with OCR. Perhaps this may be sufficient. Well, it's not meant that way. Still, it's a beginning, because very often if you take data from one insurance and put it to another insurance, but they may not be compatible. What they collected there may have nothing new for the other side and the way back. So usually it depends on how are the services on that level developing. Or a smart car. Should I be able to take my music taste and the seat configuration from one hired car to the other? Yes, why not? But are they really compatible? Does it work that way? So this is something where probably we will see the effect much later. But the first idea is, and it has nothing to do with data protection. It's not about deleting the data or restricting something. It's more about being able to leave, again, the lock-in effect. So it's an economic infringement, perhaps, in some of the business models that are existing. Within 1 month, by the way. Information about logic involved. This is interesting because there's a recital. The recitals are the things explaining everything in the beginning. They are more valid than nothing, but not as valid as the legal text. And in the recitals it is each data processing with all the logic behind. So all the algorithms should be made accessible to the users, the data subjects affected, and then they add at least for profiling. Okay, so this probably will mean that this information will often not be disclosed. There had been court rulings in the last decades because this is also an old idea, and at least in Germany, our very big credit scoring agencies they restricted the access to this information because of business secrets, and the court said it's a right to restrict this access. So we'll see how it works. But I think for the future, again, if there are decisions made perhaps on your professional life, on your health, on your treatment, on everything, then perhaps it's very necessary that some people get the information or even you get the information. Have you been discriminated or not? Is it a fair treatment or not? To have the possibility to find out about it. So this is something which may be interpreted differently now and better, I think, in the future, within 1 month. The complaints can come at every second to our supervisory authorities, and they are coming. They're 10 times, 20 times as much as before, and it's hardly possible to deal with all the complaints. Some are very, a pain in the ass only, and some are real. Some are really structural deficiencies that have to be solved, and some are, my neighbor has a wrong website or so, something like that. Okay, but this means we have to check, and not within 1 month, only if it's possible. So, what about you? Which roles do you play? The definition of a controller is that these are the ones processing the personal data. No, they determining the purposes and means of the processing. They decide on what is necessary, what are we doing. So those who are, this is my business model. I want to use those data. I want to use them in this way, then I'm the controller. Those who are really treating the data, that can be the controller themselves, but it can be somebody on behalf of the controller, a data center perhaps, and this is then the processor. So they are not that responsible on the determination of the means because they get this information, they have to do that. It's like an order. But of course, it's also an offer. So usually it's a negotiation and there's a contract. The data subjects, that is those whose data are processed, and then the producers of the products, services, and applications. They're not mentioned in the real legal text, but in a recital, and only in the sense of they should be encouraged. So I think most of you are at least also a producer, so a developer. Some are perhaps controllers or work for controllers, some are processors. Everybody is a data subject. But the obligations for the developers, no. There's no obligation, so this is a short talk, no obligation of the GDPR on the developers. But of course, if these software tools should be used by controllers, so by those who want to use some software, or if you're a controller also in another role, then it has, of course, an important relevance to know the GDPR. And the design issue is also really woven into the design of the GDPR itself. In the very front, it is the processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind. This is such a big sentence. Again, from 1995, okay. And it's not, if the German people here, if you look into the German translation, you cannot find this sentence. It looks totally different. But of course it's very good to be an engineer because you serve mankind. It's clear, right? It's about the dreams to come true, and therefore we are right in the spot of the GDPR. Yes, take a photo. Okay, and now we come to this one thing which is new and addressing data protection by design. It's only one paragraph. It's so abstract. It's everything and nothing. And especially, it's targeting the controllers. The controllers, they have an obligation to do that. Okay, fair enough. The producers, I told you, should be encouraged. How are you encouraged? But I think by giving you money, probably. Not that I can do that, but that the controllers ask for this service, ask for this criteria, and use their procurement system to say, we want to prefer this very good, well-designed product with data protection by design. This has to be preferred over the others. Meaning you have those who think they're good at GDPR compliance may have a better starting position. The controllers have not read it very well, but we try to encourage them, to encourage you. And also the states, with their funding schemes, they could encourage also very, very good things. Or standardization initiatives. If there's a good standardization that makes it so much easier for the APIs or so, then it can be encouragement. If there are tools for only the infrastructure, like open source tools that help in software development, that are usable for everybody for free, for example, encouragement. So I think the state and others, they can do a lot more than they think, but hardly anybody is reading that. The data protection by design means, as usual, think of the full life cycle, start in the beginning, end at the end. So think ahead what is happening with all the phases of data protection. And one thing is very well stressed is the data minimizing way, how to be really data minimizing, which is not so easy. And what is the starting setting should be maximum data protection friendly. The first paragraph, and this is only a short version here, of data protection by design is about, first of all, excuses. Taking into account the state of the art, the cost of... So their first things, okay, I look at the state of the art, I don't find anything well, so I don't have to do it. Not really, but... if it's really not available, if nobody can think of a good solution, who should be then stressed or demanded to do that? The cost of implementation, similar. It may be there, but perhaps expensive. The nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing, okay. That is about if it's a risky data processing, decision-making by algorithms, or sensitive data such as medical data, for example, or criminal data. This is something where it has to be done a little bit more, and usually it is already done a little bit more. And so the risk of varying likelihood and so on, they have to be taken into account. And then the controller, those who are not doing the development by themselves, they should make sure to implement the appropriate technical and organizational measures which are designed to implement data protection principles. This was in the very beginning with the transparency, fairness, data minimization, storage limitation, purpose, and so on. They are not so well defined that we can really have the metrics and the checklist to say, yes, this is good, this is better, and this is totally beyond or so. It's very difficult. It's so abstract. But it does not mean that it cannot be done. And we are then looking into the second paragraph. This is the default thing. What is the default for the data processing? And then I go back, taking into account, This is a thing that is in many paragraphs, in 24, 25, 32, taking into account, think first, and write down that you don't do something. But with a default, there's no excuse. The default has to be limited to what is necessary, which is not new. It was already in the data protection principles, but still, it's something where it must not be as a default setting more data processing than really required. And to the amount of personal data, the extent of processing, how are they analyzed, the period of storage and accessibility. And when I look at, I think all data processing tools or services, then usually the default is set in another way. For example, tracking, I think the default would be no tracking, unless it's the purpose. Or personalized recommendations, if I want this service, like personalized medicine, if I go to the doctor and disclose nothing, I don't show you anything, I don't tell you, but please treat me, does not work. But if I want to buy a book, why should the information be automatically disclosed or as a standard be disclosed about all my interests? Probably not. But if I want to get recommendations, of course it's possible. So this default thing means this is the starting point, and then, because of consent, everybody can agree to do more. It's also the protection of children. Many children know more of the adults, but protection of those who don't know. And then get used to a system, and if they are asked, they can give more information. This is very often overlooked, but think about it. There are no excuses here. There should be something which is perhaps also with some economic idea behind, similar to this data portability, where I told you how to get data out of a system and put them to another system. Okay, how do we build them in? So you've seen abstract law. They are less than one page how to really do that. It's a real gap between the law and how to use it in practice. We propose something, even long before the GDPR, which is still compliant with what is there. And we call it a data protection model with protection goals. CIA is not the American Secret Service here. It's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And everybody probably knows in the room about what about confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Here, it's the data subject's perspective, but still, most, I think, have a feeling how to deal with this information. For example, do you want or have to protect the data that are stored? And now there are 3 more protection goals, and we use them since 2009 to discuss with developers, because they understood already CIA, those, and were used to think about the adverse idea, so how to attack confidentiality. Is it something where this really can be guaranteed? How much do I need? If it's a broadcasting view here, of course, it's not confidential. It should be available, right? It's a different target. But the others are unlinkability, transparency, and intervenability. Interesting words. And they match the data protection principles, although they have a different wording, which is, of course, not good, but these are older than the GDPR. The unlinkability protection goal means that domains have to be separated, and here you see the purpose again. If I collect data for the tax purpose, I must not use, at least in Germany, them for other purposes. The tax system is separated on purpose and for the purpose. And this is also, if I disclose my data to the doctor, they must not give it to my to my school, for example. And there might be some exceptions if it's very, very contagious or so, if if it's a vital interest of the school, perhaps, but usually it has to be separated. And therefore, this is something where we need to separate processes, storage media, and think about how to guarantee it. Sometimes it's also about showing this is for a different purpose. You must not use it. It's not so good, of course, if it's not really implemented. Okay. Transparency, I think everybody has an intuitive understanding. It's not about this transparency that it's happening and nobody knows. It's the transparency that everybody can know who is interested in what is happening and can be reconstructed so that the data processing can, that also the risks can be mitigated because people know about the risks and what is happening. And the intervenability, this is an unusual word in most disciplines, which is better, in fact, than the transparency word, where everybody has some intuitive feeling, but different ones. And here it's about the data subject rights to intervene if necessary. The first idea came when we had an ambient intelligence system on people who were monitored for their whole life, and because they were very old and they could fall on the floor and they needed help. And so sensors were all over the place, including in their beds. And then we asked for how to deactivate the sensors. I want to sleep in the bed, but perhaps I have some guests. And I don't want this organization to monitor what is happening here. And they say, no, you cannot deactivate the sensors. Oh, yes, but I want to deactivate the sensors. No, but then we cannot rescue you anymore. But this is fair, of course. They cannot be liable for me if I deactivate the sensors. Of course, they cannot rescue me, which is okay because they are guests and they may rescue me. But it's not possible, and it was very difficult first to find the legal basic in the law. Why is it necessary to deactivate sensors? And there might be also some situations where it's not possible, but here it was really necessary that they changed their system, and therefore the intervenability became clearer and clearer, that it's necessary not to rely on everything is coded and is working well and nobody can intervene, but we have to be able to stop. And this may change the conditions to be rescued, to be liable. But the same with the autonomous cars. When are they on their own? When do they put back the responsibility to the driver? This has to be decided. But something where it's never possible that somebody can intervene, this is very creepy. Okay, so we had some more work to be more specific on the coding thing. I'm rushing through that. But again, these protection goals make sense also to think about new technologies which are not well reflected in any law. But very often it depends on the purposes and the legal grounds, and the risks that have to be assessed. I told you they are also including discrimination and other risks. And design patterns have been discussed with our groups and Jaap-Henk Hoopman, among others. And he did something which is more the database view, how to minimize data and how to think about, can you minimize the data more? Can you delete records or not get the data records at all? How to separate them if necessary. And of course, for a relational database, that would mean that it's not a possibility to join these fields, to be abstract, to be more general and, for example, blur the information, give only ranges of the age and nothing specific on the birth date, for example, how to hide them, how to demonstrate your compliance, how to enforce that the system is running, and the communication with the data subject on information and control. This is not only a nice picture, it's also more explained in a paper and some more privacy patterns. And there's even the privacy patterns org domain where people can put on nice privacy patterns. They are categorized and may make sense to look up those privacy patterns, which, well, I think everybody can participate, which means it's a little bit, well, the structure is not so clear, but still it's good to understand what is there already, and other researchers are now trying to structure and to make it clearer again. But for example, data breach notification is demanded by the GDPR, but how to make sure that you know about a data breach and that you know that it's really a data breach, and that you are quick enough to inform the supervisory authorities within, at max, 72 hours. And, of course, think about the risks of the users. For example, if their password is stolen, what do they have to do if financial data are affected? And we get from my small area, it's less than 3 million inhabitants in Schleswig-Holstein, several data breach notifications every day. Yeah, now, not before the GDPR, there was a few per month, but now every day several. Or invisible metadata, often forgotten because they're invisible. So you perhaps need the metadata, but should they be shared with others if the users take their photos, their Word files, whatever? Why not sanitize the information? And there are very small patterns being explained, and then it can be decided, do you want to adopt them? Are they the right way to go, or don't they play a role? So there is already something done on the code. Some people have published something with specific GDPR relevance, but this mainly boils down to you become more structured and transparent, and you know what is happening. Yes, you're already professional, you know everything, but perhaps to rethink what has been done. And I have to admit, we restructured our data processing as well and found some parts that could be optimized. So it was a healthy exercise to think again, to document and find out where we were good and where we thought we were good but were not. But of course now we are better. Okay, about deletion, something is here about if there's not used functionality, how to strip that, and so on. Of course, there are some dependencies that are very difficult because nobody is having their code probably only on their own. But here it's a small test from 2016 from Republica. Who owns the website? If you go to a media website, how many requests are open from the browser of the user, of course, on behalf of Bild.de or Spiegel or some other newspapers or online newspaper websites, which means, and they proved it here in this talk, there may be a risk, for example, with the banners and advertisement, they put in some Trojans for those because the banner system is not very well checked for security purposes. Similar, if we see how many companies are around and everybody is doing only a little bit, but if this is inherited by some code or linked in by some code, then it's very difficult to still be in control. And now we have a new court ruling from June on Facebook fan pages. Those who offer Facebook fan pages and are not Facebook themselves, they are still jointly responsible for the insights program from Facebook. So if Facebook is not doing a good job, because they may not, we don't know yet, apply the GDPR principles for their insights or user analysis, then the Facebook fan page providers are joint controllers and may also pay part of the fines. This now is under debate, but already decided. So the debate is how to work with this decision, meaning if you inherit code, you have to make sure, is it now something dynamic? Can you rely on something? Can you be liable? Or has there be something clear that you cannot be liable, that perhaps the controller, of course, has to check what is happening, or other guarantees that the professionality is improved? So this, I think, is a very big thing. And perhaps on the old ideas of what and how much to implement, Tim Berners-Lee said, because everybody said, oh, we should have put more security into the World Wide Web, shouldn't we? And he said, no. He said, perhaps not, because at that point it was more important to get out, to be visible, and not to put in security already. Perhaps we wouldn't have finished then. Vint Cerf disagreed, said he regretted in not building in more security features in the basic internet protocols, but I understand both positions. Of course, now we are we have learned from history, I would say. Perhaps we are not more clever, but I see with, for example, IoT, the same mistakes are repeated that we know already, where we know the solutions, or for industry support, or for cars. The same mistakes are repeated. Why? Now we of course have a better starting position than Tim Berners-Lee. Okay, so now I cannot understand that it's not better installed by default, and now I'm talking about security. Okay, the conclusions are we are still missing a few puzzle pieces. There are some initiatives to collect them, like the privacy patterns or this European Data Protection Initiative, IPAN. You can check out the webpage. I will provide the slides, of course. Building in security, we are not there. This has failed. So this is something where I'm quite astonished that we haven't seen more progress. Building in data protection is even less developed. So you are all pioneers if you join me in working on in this field. And we have to take the focus to the perspective of the individuals. And I think it's very necessary because we depend so much more on computer systems, on data processing. And this means it's not only demanded by the GDPR to implement data protection in the data processing system, not only technology, also processes, organization, and so on. And I'm pretty sure it will be much more demanded by controllers. They have to demand it. And it's also good if they demand it, because those who are then better off, they can prove that the state of the art can be better, that they have a better position in this hopefully level playing field, and that also the small ones now, this is a very optimistic view from my side, but can conquer with the bigger companies that are still trying to reinterpret the GDPR and not doing the real stuff on building in some guarantees for security and data protection. But if there are good solutions, they have to be made visible. Otherwise, the supervisory authorities wouldn't know that the state of the art has enhanced, and therefore there's no excuse anymore to have a worse solution. And this is now something where I'd not only like to see your questions, but your output, and that perhaps over the next 5 years we get a so good repository of code, of concepts that can be used also to show it is possible to implement much more in the GDPR than before, and for the new systems like algorithms and deciding on some big data tools or autonomous IoT, whatever things, I think we are really asking for good solutions. Otherwise, it's much too risky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marit. We're going to take 3 questions in the room now, and then we'll go up. Let's start with a very determined guy in green.
First of all, thank you for the talk. It's great to see data protection in this kind of conference as well. I was going to ask kind of an open question about the right to deletion, but I'm guessing that will always be the answer. It depends. So instead, I'll go for a really specific scenario. Lots of people here are probably building algorithms of some sort, some of which have memory, right? It's quite a specific question deliberately. So let's say that in some of these algorithms, there are identifiers that can identify a person uniquely. So someone is a doctor, is 27, and is from a small village, then that's enough to singly identify them. If that person asks for deletion, it's easy to erase a couple of CSVs, but the model can still rebuild that information because it was trained on it and it has memory. Does that imply, and I am trying to get to something that's a yes or no answer, that model needs to now be retrained and that it can no longer exist, or is that not the right interpretation?
Very educated question. There's a paper from Schmattikov and others from 2017 working on how much does the training reveal on individuals. So even if the doctor has not asked for deletion, is it clear from the training material, which is only from the structure now learned by the algorithm, already clear that he was part in this scenery? So it's even one step further, and then the deletion obviously would not be sufficient. This is not decided on the level of the GDPR, and there's also another thing of artificial or sophisticated, so generated files. If you take, for example, our demographic information here, and we are building totally different data sets, are they personal data? So they have never been part of anything, but because it's only statistic information. But we mimic something in a different data set that is equivalent enough, perhaps. So I think this can be anonymous data because there are no real persons behind. But now if a person comes into the room and the demographic statistics change, then it's similar to your question, how to put that in the other data set as well. So I know a few computer scientists who think about it. I know no lawyer right now thinking about that. And it would not be directly applicable that this information has to be deleted. And also because what was the reason why this doctor was already in the data set? If he agreed to that, like consent or contract or whatever, then it's only to be deleted for the future, the effect for the future. Of course, if it's something where it has to be corrected because he put in false information and now this algorithm is working wrongly for so many people, then it's the interest of everybody to correct that, of course. But there are other parts. And if this information, now the last thing for the very specialists here, if this information is not directly visible in, because there's no direct personal information, it can be that he influenced the data set, but it's not clear what to change. So you offered now to rebuild your training, but perhaps you have a trained thing and how to remove it. Then we have Article 11. And this is that specific rights won't apply if it's not possible that the individual can be identified. This is underestimated. So not many people know Article 11. It's not understood. It's in fact, it's about blurring by cookies, for example. If we have a cookie that may be shared by other people, I disclose my cookie information, then the provider can say, I won't give you information because I'm not sure about that. And this means probably no need to rebuild, but the risk may need some other treatment. Because of the risk, it may be some other treatments that have less to do with the data protection directive or regulation here. But it's a very interesting, if you're writing papers on that, I'd like to read them. No, because it's really not much discussed yet. Not many people have understood this very specific problem.
Yeah, so I wanted to challenge a bit your stance on GDPR. Maybe you heard Peter Thiel from Palantir. He said GDPR is basically hampering startups because they don't have enough resources to build all of this complexity in. And I personally saw like smaller websites or services simply shutting down because they just don't have the money to implement GDPR compliance. And it's also another problem I've heard about is like smaller communities, like interest clubs. They also save data about their members, and like who should do that? Like they don't have an IT specialist who would like create some secure storage for that.
Mm-hmm. And therefore, my first sentence was, I did not write the GDPR. This is indeed a thing that could have been solved in a different way. Now we have it here in that way. I think the hope of the makers of the GDPR was that the setting, when it applies, because we know the text for more than 2 years now, that the normal setting is already solved. So why don't we have the standard tools that protect the data of small associations? Or why don't we have the libraries that already implement what is there, that the startups have better starting points? It's not an answer for everything. It can be very innovative that it's not simply not possible that something has already been solved. But all this documentation exercise, it's not about everybody should reinvent the wheel, but rely on a stable foundation. And this is missing. And this is now the problem. And therefore, this transition period has not been used in a good way. And now I hope that it will be used now, because we get thousands of requests from associations and small companies and so. And we have our own debates and workshops with startups. We want innovation. We want clever information, but we need also a reliable foundation. And this has not been developed before.